The early morning mist hung low over Edinburgh Castle as Margaret Campbell adjusted the heavy woolen fabric one final time. As a royal wardrobe keeper, she had overseen countless formal occasions, but today felt different. The king's request had been specific and personal. He wanted to wear a full traditional Scottish Highland dress for his visit to the Shelter Trust charity in Glasgow. Not the ceremonial version reserved for state functions, but authentic Highland attire that honored the working heritage of Scotland. Margaret's weathered hands smoothed the deep green tartan of the Royal Stuart pattern. The kilt had been hand-woven by the last of the traditional weavers in the Highlands, each thread carrying centuries of Scottish pride. The wool came from sheep that grazed the same hills where clan warriors once stood against invading armies. This wasn't just clothing, it was living history. Your Majesty requested the Styne dub be authentic as well, Margaret murmured to herself, examining the small ceremonial knife that would be tucked into the king's sock. The blade bore the ancient symbol of the thistle, Scotland's national flower, and had been crafted by a blacksmith whose family had served the crown for 12 generations. Down the hall, King Charles was reviewing briefing papers about the Shelter Trust, a charity that had been operating in Glasgow's East End for over 30 years. The organization provided not just beds and meals for the homeless, but job training, mental health support, and a pathway back to independent living. What impressed the king most was their success rate. Nearly 70% of people who stayed at their facilities for more than 3 months eventually found permanent housing and employment. The charity's founder, Sarah Mackenzie, had started the work after her own brother died on the streets of Glasgow during a particularly harsh winter in 1991. She had been just 23 years old, fresh out of university with a degree in social work, when she decided that no family should endure what hers had experienced. Using her small inheritance, she rented a former church hall and began offering hot meals 3 nights a week. What began as a simple soup kitchen had grown into a comprehensive support network. The Shelter Trust now operated 4 residential facilities, a job training center, and a mobile outreach unit that visited the most vulnerable people living rough on Glasgow's streets. They had partnerships with local hospitals, mental health services, and employers willing to give second chances to people rebuilding their lives. The king's decision to visit in Highland dress carried deep meaning for the Scottish people. It demonstrated his understanding that this wasn't just another royal engagement, but a connection to the heart of Scottish community values. The Highland tradition emphasized clan loyalty, caring for one's people, and ensuring that no member of the community was left behind. These values aligned perfectly with the mission of the Shelter Trust. As the royal motorcade prepared to depart from Edinburgh, news crews were already setting up outside the charity's main building in Glasgow. The sight of their king in traditional Scottish attire would send a powerful message. This visit was about Scottish solutions to Scottish problems, rooted in centuries of community care and mutual support. Sarah Mackenzie stood in the main dining hall of the facility, watching her staff make final preparations. Tables that usually seated 40 people for meals had been arranged to create space for the king to meet with residents and volunteers. The kitchen staff had prepared traditional Scottish fare, tablet, shortbread, and fresh bannocks, alongside their usual hearty soup and sandwiches. "Mind you don't fuss too much," Sarah called to her volunteers. "His Majesty is coming to see our real work, not some polished version for the cameras." At 65, Sarah had developed a reputation for speaking plainly, whether addressing government ministers or members of the royal family. Her approach had earned respect across Scotland's political spectrum and had helped secure funding that kept the charity operating even during the most difficult economic times. The residents of the facility represented the full spectrum of homelessness in modern Scotland. There was James, a former soldier who had struggled with post-traumatic stress after serving in Afghanistan. His military pension wasn't enough to cover Glasgow's rising rents, and a series of temporary accommodations had eventually led him to the streets. Now, 6 months into his stay at the Shelter Trust, he was training to become a counselor for other veterans facing similar challenges. Mary had been a teacher for 30 years before a combination of divorce, job loss, and mental health struggles left her sleeping in her car. The shame of her situation had prevented her from seeking help for months. When winter arrived and her car broke down, she finally accepted assistance from the mobile outreach team. The education and organizational skills that had made her an excellent teacher were now being channeled into helping other residents navigate the complex systems of benefits, housing applications, and job searches. Tommy represented the charity's most challenging cases, a young man who had aged out of the foster care system with no family support and limited education. He had been living rough for 3 years, supporting himself through occasional day labor and sometimes less legal means. The Shelter Trust approach focused on practical skills, training rather than judgment. Tommy was learning basic literacy and numeracy alongside carpentry skills that local contractors valued. The diversity of stories represented the reality that homelessness could affect anyone. Economic downturns, family breakdowns, health crises, or simply the high cost of housing could push people from stability into crisis faster than most realized. The Shelter Trust philosophy emphasized that providing housing was only the beginning. People needed comprehensive support to address the complex factors that had contributed to their homelessness. Dr. Robert Fraser, the charity's volunteer coordinator, had spent the previous week preparing briefing materials for the King's visit. A retired psychiatrist, Dr. Fraser had been volunteering with the charity for over a decade after witnessing the inadequacy of mental health services for homeless populations. His clinical experience provided valuable insights into the trauma-informed approaches that made the charity's work effective. The key, Dr. Fraser explained to newer volunteers, is understanding that homelessness is often the visible symptom of invisible wounds. Many of our residents have experienced childhood trauma, military combat, domestic violence, or severe mental illness. Traditional approaches that focus only on housing miss the deeper healing that needs to happen. The Shelter Trust trauma-informed model meant that staff received extensive training in recognizing and responding to the effects of trauma. Rather than viewing difficult behaviors as personal failings, they understood them as adaptive responses to overwhelming experiences. This approach required patience, consistency, and a willingness to rebuild trust with people who had often been failed by multiple systems. Margaret Campbell made her final inspection of the Royal Highland dress as the King's mourning schedule concluded. The outfit was complete, the kilt properly pleated and pinned, the sporran positioned correctly, the Steigen dub secured, and the traditional woolen socks pulled to the precise height. The Prince Charlie jacket and vest provided the formal element appropriate for a royal engagement, while the traditional elements honored Scotland's cultural heritage. The King's decision to wear Highland dress for this particular visit would be interpreted as a statement about the importance of Scottish identity and values in addressing contemporary social challenges. The Highland tradition of clan responsibility, ensuring that all members of the community were protected and supported, provided a historical framework for understanding modern approaches to homelessness prevention and response. As the royal motorcade departed Edinburgh for the journey to Glasgow, advanced security teams were conducting final sweeps of the charity facility. The challenge was maintaining appropriate security while preserving the informal, welcoming atmosphere that made the Shelter Trust effective. Residents had been briefed about the visit, but Sarah Mackenzie had insisted that their daily routines continue as normally as possible. The hour-long journey through the Scottish countryside provided time for reflection on the significance of the visit. The landscapes passing outside the windows told the story of Scotland's economic transformation, from agricultural communities to industrial powerhouses to the modern service economy. Each transition had created both opportunities and casualties, and organizations like the Shelter Trust existed to help those who had been left behind by economic change. Local media coverage was focusing on the symbolism of the Highland dress, but Sarah Mackenzie hoped the lasting impact would be increased public understanding of homelessness as a complex social issue requiring comprehensive solutions. The royal visit provided a platform to highlight the charity's innovative approaches and demonstrate that effective interventions were possible with adequate resources and community support. The morning preparation phase was drawing to a close as all elements converged on Glasgow. The king, resplendent in Highland dress that honored Scotland's heritage, was approaching a charity that embodied Scotland's values of community care and mutual support. The residents and staff of the Shelter Trust were prepared to share their stories and demonstrate the transformative power of compassionate, comprehensive assistance. The stage was set for a royal visit that would transcend ceremonial obligations to create genuine connections between the crown and some of Scotland's most vulnerable citizens. In a tradition of Highland chiefs who were expected to know and care for every member of their clan, the king was preparing to engage directly with people whose lives have been shaped by modern Scotland's social and economic challenges. As the motorcade approached Glasgow's East End, the anticipation was building for an encounter that would honor both Scotland's historical values and its contemporary commitment to ensuring that no one was left behind by society's progress. The sound of bagpipes filled the air as the royal motorcade turned onto Gallowgate Street in Glasgow's East End. A small crowd had gathered despite the early hour, drawn by news of the king's visit and the rare opportunity to see their monarch in full Highland dress. Children pressed against the barriers, their faces bright with excitement, while elderly residents remembered other royal visits from decades past. Sarah Mackenzie stood at the entrance to the Shelter Trust's main building, watching the black cars approach. She wore her best jacket, but had deliberately chosen practical shoes and her everyday handbag. This visit needed to be about the charity's work, not royal pageantry. Beside her, Dr. Fraser checked his watch one final time, while the facility's residents watched from windows above. The first car stopped, and security personnel quickly established a protective perimeter while maintaining the informal atmosphere Sarah had requested. When the king emerged from his vehicle, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the crowd. The sight of their monarch in authentic Highland dress, the green tartan kilt, traditional sporran, and ceremonial sgiandub, created an immediate connection to Scottish identity and pride. "Your Majesty," Sarah stepped forward with a respectful curtsy. "Welcome to the Shelter Trust. We're honored by your presence and grateful for your interest in our work." The king's response was warm and immediate. "Ms. Mackenzie, the honor is mine. I read extensively about your organization's innovative approaches, and I'm eager to learn from your experience." His voice carried genuine interest, not the polite formality that often characterized royal engagements. As they walked toward the building's entrance, the king paused to acknowledge the crowd that had gathered. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, had pushed to the front of the barriers with her grandmother. She held a small Scottish flag and wore a nervous smile. "What's your name, young lady?" the king asked, approaching the barrier. "Emma, your Majesty," she whispered, then found her voice. "My gran says you're wearing proper Scottish clothes today." "Your grandmother is quite right," the king replied, adjusting his kilt slightly. "These clothes represent the proud traditions of Scotland, including the Highland value of caring for our neighbors." That's exactly what Ms. Mackenzie and her team do here every day. The interaction, captured by photographers, would later appear on front pages across Scotland, but in the moment it served to ease the formal tension that often surrounded royal visits. The king's natural manner with the child and his reference to Highland values in connection with the charity's mission established the tone for the entire visit. Inside the building, the transformation was immediately apparent. What had once been a warehouse now housed a comprehensive support center. The main floor contained a dining area, counseling offices, job training workshops, and administrative spaces. The residential floors above provided private rooms for up to 40 people, each furnished with dignity rather than institutional efficiency. James Mitchell, the former soldier who had been residing at the facility for 6 months, stood near the reception desk in his best clothes. At 42, he carried himself with military bearing despite the challenges that had brought him to the shelter. Sarah had asked him to share his story with the king, recognizing that his articulate manner and military background might create common ground for conversation. James served 3 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah explained as they approached. He's now training to become a peer counselor for other veterans experiencing housing difficulties. The king's attention immediately focused on James with the interest of someone who understood military service through his own family's traditions. "Which regiment?" he asked. "The Black Watch, Your Majesty. 3rd Battalion." James stood straighter, pride evident in his voice despite his current circumstances. "A distinguished regiment with a proud history," the king replied. "What brought you to Glasgow after your service?" James had prepared for this question, but his answer remained entirely genuine. "I thought I could handle the transition back to civilian life on my own, sir. Military training teaches you to be self-reliant, to solve problems without asking for help. But some problems are bigger than individual willpower can solve." The conversation continued as they moved into the main dining area, where other residents had gathered for their morning coffee. The king's questions demonstrated genuine understanding of the challenges facing veterans. He asked about the availability of mental health services, the adequacy of military pensions for modern housing costs, and the effectiveness of job training programs for translating military skills into civilian employment. Mary Douglas, the former teacher, had been selected to represent the demographic of middle-class professionals who had become homeless through circumstances beyond their control. At 58, she retained the articulate manner that had served her well in the classroom, but her story revealed how quickly financial stability could disappear. "I taught primary school for 30 years, Mary explained when introduced to the king. "I owned my home, had a pension building up, thought I was secure. Then my marriage ended, I lost my job due to education cuts, and my mental health suffered. The rent on even a small flat became impossible to manage." The king listened intently as Mary described the shame and isolation that had prevented her from seeking help initially. "There's a stigma attached to admitting you can't cope," she said. "Professional people especially struggle with asking for assistance. We're supposed to have our lives sorted out." Dr. Fraser joined the conversation at this point, explaining the psychological barriers that prevented many people from accessing available services. "Pride becomes an obstacle to survival," he noted. "The Shelter Trust works to eliminate shame from the equation by treating housing instability as a practical problem requiring practical solutions." Tommy McPherson, the youngest resident at 22, represented the charity's work with care leavers and young people aging out of institutional support. His story was different from James and Mary's. He had never experienced stable housing or family support. For Tommy, the Shelter Trust represented the first consistent adult guidance he had received. "I grew up in foster homes," Tommy explained to the king with the directness of someone accustomed to explaining his circumstances. "Some were good, some weren't. When you turn 18, the support stops, but the problems don't. I wasn't ready to manage on my own." The king's questions revealed understanding of the systemic gaps that affected young people leaving care. Tommy described his current carpentry training with enthusiasm, explaining how learning practical skills had given him confidence and a sense of direction. "Before coming here, I thought I was just unlucky. Now I understand that with the right support, I can build a different kind of life." The residential tour revealed the careful attention to dignity that characterized the charity's approach. Each room was private, furnished with a proper bed, wardrobe, and desk. Residents were encouraged to personalize their spaces, and many had displayed photographs, artwork, or small collections that reflected their individual interests and identities. "We learned early on that institutional environments, however well-intentioned, can strip away people's sense of self," Sarah explained as they climbed to the second floor. "These rooms aren't just temporary accommodation. They're spaces where people can begin rebuilding their identity and planning their future." The king examined the practical details with the attention of someone who understood that dignity lay in the specifics. Proper curtains rather than institutional blinds, comfortable seating areas, small refrigerators that allowed residents to store personal food items. Each element contributed to an environment that supported recovery rather than merely providing shelter. The job training workshop occupied a large space on the ground floor, equipped with tools and workstations for multiple trades. Residents could learn basic construction skills, food service, retail operations, or office administration, depending on their interests and aptitudes. The programs emphasize practical experience over theoretical instruction, with local employers providing apprenticeship opportunities for graduates. Employment is crucial for sustainable housing, Dr. Fraser explained as they observed residents working on various projects. But many of our residents have been out of the workforce for months or years. They need to rebuild not just practical skills, but confidence in their ability to meet employer expectations. The king spent considerable time observing the training programs, asking detailed questions about completion rates, employer partnerships, and the challenges of matching residents' capabilities with available job opportunities. His questions demonstrated understanding that employment was about more than earning money. It provided structure, social connection, and sense of purpose essential for long-term stability. The morning's encounters had revealed the complexity of modern homelessness and the comprehensive approach required for effective intervention. Each resident's story illustrated different pathways into housing instability, but all had benefited from the charity's philosophy that people needed more than just shelter. They needed supportive relationships, practical skills, and opportunities to rebuild their lives with dignity. As they concluded the tour of the residential facilities, the king's engagement with residents and staff had created an atmosphere of genuine dialogue rather than formal presentation. His questions revealed understanding of both the individual struggles and systemic factors that contributed to homelessness, while his Highland dress served as a visible reminder that Scottish values of community care remained relevant to contemporary challenges. The visit was proceeding exactly as Sarah had hoped, focusing attention on the charity's work while demonstrating that effective solutions existed when communities committed adequate resources and comprehensive support. The king's authentic interest in learning from the residents' experiences was creating opportunities for meaningful exchange rather than ceremonial obligation. The real test of the Shelter Trust's work happened not in the comfortable residential facility, but on the streets of Glasgow, where their mobile outreach team operated 7 days a week. Sarah Mackenzie had specifically requested that the king accompany the afternoon outreach round, understanding that this would provide the most authentic view of homelessness in Scotland's largest city. The mobile unit was a converted van equipped with medical supplies, warm clothing, food, and, most importantly, the materials needed to build trust with people who had often been failed by multiple systems. The team consisted of Linda Morrison, a registered nurse with 20 years of experience in community health, and David Reed, a former resident of the Shelter Trust who now worked as a peer support specialist. Your Majesty, Linda explained as they prepared to depart, street outreach requires a different approach than residential work. Many of the people we encounter have been rough, sleeping for months or years. They've developed survival strategies that don't easily accommodate offers of help. The king had changed from his formal Highland dress into more practical clothing for the street work, though he retained the kilt and traditional elements that identified him as distinctly Scottish. The decision to participate in outreach work, rather than simply observing from a distance, demonstrated a level of commitment that surprised even Sarah Mackenzie. David Reed shared his perspective as they drove through Glasgow's city centre toward their first stop. I spent 2 years sleeping rough before accepting help from the Shelter Trust, he explained. The longer you're on the streets, the harder it becomes to believe that change is possible. Trust becomes a luxury you can't afford. Their first stop was an underpass near Glasgow Central Station, where several people had established temporary shelters using cardboard, tarps, and sleeping bags. The location provided protection from rain and wind, but the constant noise and foot traffic made rest nearly impossible. Linda and David approached with familiar ease, calling out greetings and checking on people they had visited many times before. Margaret Wilson had been sleeping rough for 8 months after losing her private rental flat due to benefit delays. At 63, she suffered from arthritis and diabetes, conditions that made sleeping outdoors particularly dangerous during Glasgow's harsh winters. She had initially refused all offers of residential accommodation, convinced that accepting help would result in losing what little independence she retained. "Hello, Margaret," Linda called softly, approaching the makeshift shelter. "How are you managing today? This is David, and we have someone special with us who wanted to learn about our work." The king's presence created an unusual dynamic. Margaret had seen news coverage of royal visits to various charities, but had never imagined meeting a member of the royal family while living in a railway underpass. Her initial reaction was embarrassment, then curiosity about why the king would choose to visit people in her circumstances. "Your Majesty," Margaret said with instinctive courtesy, attempting to tidy her small living space. "I'm sorry you have to see me like this. This isn't how I planned to spend my retirement." The king's response reflected the genuine interest he had demonstrated throughout the visit. "Please don't apologize, Margaret. I'm here because I want to understand the challenges you're facing. Would you be willing to tell me about your situation?" Margaret's story unfolded gradually, shaped by the patient questioning techniques that Linda and David had perfected through years of outreach work. She had worked as a shop assistant for 40 years, saving carefully for retirement despite modest wages. Her private pension was small, but combined with state benefits, it had been sufficient for a small flat in Glasgow's East End. The crisis began when changes to housing benefit calculations reduced her monthly income by £60. The landlord, already planning to renovate the building for higher-paying tenants, used her difficulty paying full rent as grounds for eviction. Margaret found herself competing for accommodation in a rental market where landlords could demand references, deposits, and advance payments that excluded benefit recipients. The housing office said I made myself intentionally homeless by not accepting a flat in Castle Milk, Margaret explained, referring to a housing scheme on Glasgow's outskirts. "But I've lived in this area for 30 years. My doctor, my friends, my shops are all here. At my age, starting over in a place where I know nobody felt impossible." The conversation revealed the complex web of policies and procedures that could trap vulnerable people in homelessness. Strict eligibility requirements designed to prevent abuse of the system often prevented legitimate cases from accessing assistance. Margaret's situation was further complicated by her diabetes medication, which required refrigeration she couldn't maintain while sleeping rough. David Reed shared his own experience with similar bureaucratic obstacles, helping Margaret understand that her difficulties navigating the system reflected problems with the system itself, not personal inadequacy. This peer support approach was central to the outreach team's effectiveness. People who had successfully overcome homelessness could provide both practical guidance and emotional encouragement. The king's questions demonstrated understanding of the systemic issues Margaret described. He asked about the adequacy of housing benefit rates, the availability of suitable accommodation for older people on benefits, and the coordination between different agencies responsible for housing, health, and social services. Linda Morrison explained the medical challenges of treating people living rough while they visited Margaret's makeshift shelter. Diabetes management requires consistent meal timing, secure medication storage, and regular monitoring. None of these are possible while sleeping rough. We're essentially practicing emergency medicine instead of preventive care. The mobile unit carried glucose testing strips, insulin cooling packs, and wound care supplies specifically for people like Margaret whose medical conditions were exacerbated by homelessness. However, Linda emphasized that medical intervention could only provide temporary relief without addressing the underlying housing problem. Their second stop involved a different demographic entirely. Under a bridge near the River Clyde, they found Sean Campbell, a 28-year-old who had been sleeping rough intermittently for 3 years. Sean's homelessness stemmed from childhood trauma, substance dependency, and multiple failed attempts to maintain stable housing. Sean's relationship with the outreach team illustrated the patience required for effective street work. He had accepted brief stays at various hostels over the years, but had always returned to the streets during periods of crisis or relapse. Rather than viewing this as failure, Linda and David understood it as part of a longer recovery process. Homelessness isn't always a straight line from rough sleeping to stable housing, David explained to the king as they approached Sean's location. Some people need multiple attempts, different types of support, or time to address underlying issues before they're ready for permanent accommodation. Sean's initial reaction to the king's presence was skepticism rather than deference. Years of disappointment with authority figures had taught him to distrust official interest in his situation. His conversation with the king was marked by direct questions about government policies affecting homeless people and challenges to assumptions about individual responsibility for homelessness. "Everyone thinks we choose to live like this," Sean said, gesturing to his sleeping bag and scattered possessions. "But when you've been failed by foster care, education, mental health services, and housing departments, the streets start feeling safer than trying again and failing again." The king's responses demonstrated respect for Sean's perspective while expressing genuine interest in understanding the barriers to accessing services. Sean described encounters with housing officers who treated him as a problem to be managed rather than a person needing assistance. He talked about hostels where theft and violence made sleep impossible, and about benefit assessments that seemed designed to find reasons for refusal rather than ways to provide help. The outreach team's approach with Sean focused on harm reduction rather than immediate housing solutions. They provided clean needles, wound care, and information about drug treatment services, while maintaining contact that could support future attempts at stability. This long-term perspective recognized that sustainable change often required multiple interventions over extended periods. The afternoon's outreach work took them to 6 different locations around Glasgow, each representing different aspects of street homelessness. They encountered a veteran who refused shelter because his dog wasn't allowed in hostels, a young woman fleeing domestic violence who feared her abuser would find her an official accommodation, and an elderly man with dementia whose family had lost contact with him months earlier. Each encounter reinforced the complexity of homelessness and the inadequacy of simple solutions. The outreach team's effectiveness lay in their ability to meet people where they were literally and figuratively, providing immediate assistance while building relationships that could eventually support longer-term change. Dr. Fraser had joined the outreach round for its final stop, bringing his psychiatric expertise to an encounter with a young man experiencing a psychotic episode. The situation required careful navigation between respecting individual autonomy and ensuring safety, while the king observed the delicate balance between compassion and professional boundaries. The day's outreach work included at the Shelter Trust Drop-In Center, where people could access showers, hot meals, and basic services without committing to residential accommodation. The center operated with minimal rules and maximum flexibility, recognizing that some people needed extended time to develop trust before accepting more intensive support. As they returned to the main facility, the king's understanding of homelessness had been transformed from theoretical knowledge to direct experience of its human complexity. The outreach work had demonstrated that effective intervention required not just resources, but sophisticated understanding of trauma, mental health, substance dependency, and the systemic barriers that prevented people from accessing available assistance. Sarah McKenzie was pleased with the king's genuine engagement with the outreach work. His willingness to spend hours on Glasgow streets, listening to difficult stories, and observing challenging situations demonstrated the kind of committed leadership that could influence public understanding and policy development. The mobile outreach experience had revealed homelessness as a multifaceted social issue requiring comprehensive, patient, and skilled intervention. The king's participation in this work, while dressed in the traditional Highland attire that symbolized Scottish community values, created a powerful connection between historical principles of clan care and contemporary approaches to supporting society's most vulnerable members. As evening approached, the Shelter Trust prepared for its daily community meal, an event that had become central to the organization's mission of building connections between residents, volunteers, and the broader Glasgow community. The dining hall filled with volunteers from across the city, retired teachers, university students, local business owners, and faith community members who had committed to regular service. The king's presence at the community meal represented more than ceremonial participation. By sharing food with homeless residents and local volunteers, He was demonstrating the Highland tradition of hospitality that recognized no social barriers when people gathered to eat. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. In Highland culture, accepting someone's hospitality created bonds of mutual respect and obligation. Elizabeth MacLeod, a retired headmistress from Glasgow's West End, had been volunteering at the Shelter Trust for 15 years. At 72, she arrived every Tuesday evening to help serve meals and had developed relationships with dozens of residents over the years. Her perspective on the king's visit reflected the views of many long-term volunteers who had witnessed the charity's evolution. Having His Majesty here in Highland dress sends a message about Scottish values, Elizabeth explained as she prepared plates in the kitchen. The Highland tradition was about chiefs knowing their people personally, caring for their welfare, ensuring no one went without shelter or food. That's exactly what we try to do here, just adapted for modern circumstances. The meal itself featured traditional Scottish fare prepared by both professional kitchen staff and residents who were developing culinary skills. The menu included cockaliki soup, steak and kidney pie, neeps and tatties, and fresh-baked bannocks. The food was hearty and substantial, designed to provide proper nutrition for people whose access to regular meals was often uncertain. Father Michael O'Sullivan, a Catholic priest whose parish included many of Glasgow's rougher areas, offered the evening blessing. His prayer acknowledged the complexity of homelessness while emphasizing the dignity of every person present. The interfaith nature of the charity's volunteer base reflected Glasgow's diverse religious communities united in commitment to social action. We gather tonight as a community that transcends the usual boundaries of class, background, and circumstance, Father O'Sullivan prayed. May our sharing of this meal remind us that we are all equally deserving of shelter, sustenance, and care. The King's table included residents, volunteers, and staff members, creating conversations that crossed traditional social divides. James Mitchell, the former soldier, found himself discussing military history with the King, while Mary Douglas, the former teacher, compared notes with volunteer Elizabeth MacLeod about changes in Scottish education. These natural interactions demonstrated the charity's success in creating an environment where people connected as individuals rather than as representatives of their circumstances. Tommy McPherson, the young man learning carpentry skills, proudly showed the King a jewelry box he had crafted in the workshop. The piece demonstrated remarkable skill for someone who had only been woodworking for 6 months, with intricate joinery and a smooth finish that reflected hours of patient effort. The King's examination of the work was thorough and appreciative, recognizing both the technical achievement and the personal growth it represented. This quality of craftsmanship could easily be sold in Edinburgh's tourist shops, the King observed. Have you considered developing a business around your woodworking skills? The conversation that followed revealed Tommy's growing confidence and ambition. The charity's job training programs had provided more than technical skills. They had helped him envision a future that included financial independence and creative satisfaction. Plans were already developing for Tommy to begin an apprenticeship with a local furniture maker who specialized in traditional Scottish pieces. Dr. Fraser used the meal setting to explain the therapeutic value of shared dining experiences for people recovering from trauma and social isolation. Eating together is one of humanity's most basic social activities, he noted. For people who have been excluded from normal social connections, sharing meals helps rebuild the fundamental skills of human interaction. The evening's program included a brief presentation about the charity's impact over its 30-year history. Sarah McKenzie shared statistics that demonstrated the effectiveness of their comprehensive approach: housing retention rates, employment outcomes, health improvements, and family reunifications. However, she emphasized that the numbers only told part of the story. Our real success is measured in lives rebuilt, families reunited, and communities strengthened, Sarah explained to the gathered audience. When someone like Tommy develops marketable skills and stable housing, the entire community benefits. When someone like Mary returns to productive work, we all gain from her experience and capabilities. The presentation included testimonials from former residents who had successfully transitioned to independent living. A video message from Robert Stewart, who had used the charity services 5 years earlier and now owned a small business, illustrated the long-term impact of comprehensive support. Robert's company employed 3 people and had become a regular donor to the Shelter Trust, completing a cycle of recovery and giving back. Evening workshops offered additional opportunities for skill development and social interaction. A literacy class met in one corner of the dining hall, where residents worked with volunteer tutors to improve reading and writing skills essential for job applications and independent living. The class included people of all ages and backgrounds, united by the recognition that education was key to expanding their options. A mental health support group met in a separate room, facilitated by Dr. Fraser and attended by residents dealing with depression, anxiety, trauma, and substance dependency issues. The group provided a safe space for people to discuss their struggles while developing coping strategies and mutual support networks. The king observed briefly, recognizing the courage required for people to share their vulnerabilities in pursuit of healing. The art therapy workshop occupied a bright room filled with paintings, drawings, and craft projects created by residents and volunteers working together. The creative expression provided an outlet for emotions that were difficult to verbalize while building skills and confidence that extended beyond artistic ability. Several residents had discovered talents they never knew they possessed, leading to new sources of self-esteem and potential career directions. Local media representatives had been granted limited access to the evening activities, capturing images and interviews that would help publicize the charity's work. However, Sarah McKenzie had insisted that residents' privacy be protected and that coverage focus on the programs rather than individual stories of hardship. The goal was to increase public understanding and support rather than exploit vulnerability for dramatic effect. Glasgow City Council representatives attended the meal, including Councillor Patricia McIntyre, who chaired the Housing Committee. Her presence represented growing recognition of the Shelter Trust as an essential partner in the city's response to homelessness. Recent policy discussions had focused on expanding funding for services that addressed the root causes of homelessness rather than simply providing emergency accommodation. The Shelter Trust demonstrates that effective intervention requires investment in comprehensive services, Councillor McIntyre explained during her brief remarks. Their approach costs more initially than basic shelter provision, but the long-term savings in healthcare, criminal justice, and social services make it the most economical option available. The economic argument for comprehensive homelessness services had become increasingly important as Scottish local authorities faced budget constraints. Studies conducted by Glasgow University had shown that the Shelter Trust's approach reduced overall public costs by preventing repeated cycles of crisis intervention. Former residents were less likely to require expensive emergency services and more likely to become tax-paying contributors to the community. As the evening meal concluded, residents and volunteers began the collaborative cleanup that reinforced the charity's emphasis on shared responsibility and community participation. Everyone present contributed to washing dishes, cleaning tables, and preparing the space for the next day's activities. The king participated naturally in these tasks, demonstrating that service knew no hierarchy. The final event of the visit was a brief ceremony recognizing long-term volunteers and celebrating recent successes. 3 residents received certificates marking their completion of job training programs, while 4 volunteers were honored for 10 years of consistent service. The recognition emphasized the charity's understanding that sustainable change required long-term commitment from both individuals and communities. Sarah McKenzie's concluding remarks focused on the future rather than past achievements. The charity was planning expansion of their job training programs, development of transitional housing for people not ready for full independence, and enhanced mental health services. These improvements would require additional funding and community support, goals that the royal visit could help advance. The king's final address to the gathered community reflected the day's experiences and learning. Speaking without notes, he connected the Highland values represented by his traditional dress to the contemporary work of the Shelter Trust. His words emphasized that caring for vulnerable community members was not charity in the sense of optional generosity, but obligation in the sense of fundamental social responsibility. The Highland tradition teaches us that a community's strength is measured not by the success of its most fortunate members, but by how well it cares for those facing the greatest challenges, the king said. The work being done here represents the best of Scottish values applied to modern circumstances. As the evening concluded and the king prepared to depart, the impact of the visit was already evident in the increased energy and pride displayed by residents, volunteers, and staff. The royal attention had validated their work while providing a platform to educate the broader public about effective approaches to homelessness intervention. The visit had succeeded in its multiple objectives, honoring Scottish traditions through the Highland dress, demonstrating royal commitment to social issues, and highlighting the innovative work of an effective charity. Most importantly, it had created genuine connections between the monarchy and some of Scotland's most vulnerable citizens, embodying the principle that effective leadership required direct engagement with the full spectrum of community life. 3 months after the king's visit to the Shelter Trust, the impact continued to ripple through Glasgow and beyond. The image of the monarch in Highland dress sharing meals with homeless residents had become an iconic representation of Scottish values in action, reproduced in newspapers, magazines, and social media platforms across the United Kingdom and internationally. The immediate aftermath of the visit brought unprecedented attention to the Shelter Trust's work. Donations increased by 400% in the month following the royal engagement, while volunteer applications rose equally dramatically. More significantly, the visit had sparked policy discussions at both local and national levels about the most effective approaches to addressing homelessness. Sarah Mackenzie found herself invited to address the Scottish Parliament's Housing Committee, where she presented evidence about the cost-effectiveness of comprehensive support services compared to crisis-only interventions. The Parliamentary Committee was particularly interested in the charity's high success rates and the potential for scaling their model to other Scottish cities. The royal visit demonstrated that our work aligns with fundamental Scottish values, Sarah testified to the committee. But values without adequate resources remain merely aspirational. We need policy changes that support preventive intervention rather than emergency response. The Scottish Government announced a new funding stream for homelessness services that emphasized the comprehensive approach pioneered by organizations like the Shelter Trust. The 3-year pilot program would support expansion of job training, mental health services, and transitional housing across Scotland's major cities. While the funding levels remain modest compared to the scale of need, it represented recognition that effective homelessness intervention required investment in long-term solutions. Margaret Wilson, the 63-year-old woman the king had met sleeping rough under the railway bridge, became a symbol of the positive change that comprehensive support could create. 6 weeks after the royal visit, Margaret had accepted accommodation at the Shelter Trust and was working with staff to address the benefit and housing issues that had led to her homelessness. Meeting His Majesty changed something for me, Margaret explained during a follow-up interview. If the king could take time to learn about my situation, maybe I was worthy of help after all. The shame that had been keeping me on the streets started to feel less important than the possibility of getting my life back. Margaret's progress illustrated the complex relationship between individual psychology and social intervention. The royal attention hadn't changed her practical circumstances immediately, but it had shifted her perception of her own worth and the legitimacy of accepting assistance. This psychological change proved crucial for her willingness to engage with the services that could address her underlying problems. Tommy McPherson's carpentry skills had developed remarkably in the months since the royal visit. His apprenticeship with the traditional furniture maker was progressing successfully, and he had completed his first commissioned piece, a replica of an 18th-century Highland writing desk ordered by a collector in Edinburgh. The technical complexity of the project demonstrated his rapid skill development and growing confidence. The furniture maker, Alexander Grant, had been initially skeptical about taking on an apprentice from the Shelter Trust. However, Tommy's dedication and natural aptitude had quickly convinced him that social circumstances bore no relationship to potential ability. Grant was now considering expanding his training program to accept additional apprentices from similar backgrounds. "Tommy's shown me that there's untapped talent in places I never thought to look," Grant explained. His background gives him a different perspective on the value of stable work and the dignity of craftsmanship. He appreciates opportunities that others might take for granted. The success stories emerging from the Shelter Trust were attracting attention from homelessness organizations across the United Kingdom. Delegations from Birmingham, Manchester, and Cardiff visited Glasgow to study the charity's methods and explore adapting their approach to different urban environments. The royal endorsement had provided credibility that accelerated these professional exchanges. Dr. Fraser had been invited to present the charity's trauma-informed approach at conferences in London and Dublin, sharing expertise that had developed through years of practical experience. His presentations emphasized that effective homelessness intervention required understanding the complex psychological factors that contributed to housing instability, not just providing accommodation. James Mitchell had completed his training as a peer counselor and was now working part-time with the charity while pursuing further education in social work. His military background and personal experience with homelessness created unique qualifications for supporting other veterans facing similar challenges. The combination of professional training and lived experience proved particularly effective. The veteran support program that James helped develop had become a model for other Scottish cities dealing with military homelessness. The program's emphasis on understanding military culture while addressing civilian reintegration challenges was attracting attention from veterans organizations and government agencies responsible for military transition services. Mary Douglas had returned to teaching through a supply position that allowed her to rebuild her career gradually while maintaining her residence at the Shelter Trust. Her experience with homelessness had given her new insights into the challenges facing vulnerable students and their families. She was developing innovative approaches to identifying and supporting children whose families were experiencing housing instability. "My time here taught me that anyone can face circumstances beyond their control," Mary reflected. "As a teacher, I now recognize signs of housing stress in my students that I might have missed before. My experience with homelessness made me a more effective educator." The educational implications of the royal visit extended beyond individual stories to broader questions about social awareness and community responsibility. Several Glasgow schools incorporated lessons about homelessness and community service into their curricula, using the King's visit as a starting point for discussing Scottish values and social action. Father O'Sullivan had organized an interfaith coalition that met monthly to coordinate religious communities' responses to homelessness. The coalition brought together Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, and Sikh organizations to share resources and avoid duplication of services. The royal visit had demonstrated that addressing homelessness was a shared community responsibility that transcended religious boundaries. The coalition's activities included a winter shelter program that operated during the coldest months, a job training initiative that connected religious communities with local employers, and an advocacy effort focused on policy changes that would prevent homelessness rather than simply respond to its symptoms. Local businesses had also increased their engagement with homelessness issues following the royal visit. A group of Glasgow employers had formed a partnership with the Shelter Trust to provide apprenticeships, entry-level positions, and mentoring for residents developing job skills. The partnership emphasized that hiring people with experience of homelessness could benefit employers as well as individuals. Restaurant owner Patricia Bell had hired 2 former Shelter Trust residents as kitchen assistants and was planning to expand the program. These employees bring a work ethic and appreciation that's sometimes missing in people who've never faced real adversity, she explained. They understand the value of stable employment in a way that makes them exceptionally reliable workers. The media attention generated by the royal visit had also influenced public attitudes toward homelessness. Opinion polling conducted by Glasgow University showed increased support for comprehensive homelessness services and reduced blame directed toward individuals experiencing housing instability. The king's respectful engagement with homeless residents had helped humanize an issue often discussed in abstract policy terms. Social media coverage of the visit had been overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise for the king's choice to wear Highland dress and his willingness to participate in street outreach work. The authentic nature of his interactions with residents and volunteers had convinced even skeptical observers that the visit represented genuine commitment rather than ceremonial obligation. The international attention generated by the visit had elevated Scotland's profile as a leader in innovative homelessness intervention. Delegations from Canada, Australia, and several European countries had visited Glasgow to study the Shelter Trust methods and explore adaptation to their own contexts. The combination of traditional Scottish values and modern evidence-based practice created a model that resonated across cultural boundaries. Academic research into the charity's approaches had accelerated following the royal visit, with universities in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Stirling collaborating on longitudinal studies of homelessness intervention effectiveness. The research would provide crucial evidence for policy development while contributing to international understanding of best practices. The King's office had maintained contact with the Shelter Trust through regular updates on the residents he had met during the visit. Royal interest in the outcomes of specific individuals demonstrated that the engagement went beyond ceremonial participation to genuine concern for results. This ongoing attention helped sustain public interest in the charity's work. Plans were developing for the King to visit other innovative homelessness organizations across Scotland, creating a series of engagements that would highlight effective approaches while maintaining focus on Scottish solutions to Scottish challenges. The Highland dress would remain a consistent element, reinforcing the connection between traditional values and contemporary social action. The success of the Glasgow visit had also influenced the royal family's broader approach to social engagement. Future visits would emphasize authentic interaction with service users rather than formal presentations, allowing direct learning about social issues while demonstrating royal commitment to understanding the full spectrum of community experience. As winter approached, the Shelter Trust was better prepared than ever to support Glasgow's most vulnerable residents. The increased resources, enhanced public support, and strengthened policy environment created by the royal visit had expanded their capacity while maintaining the personal approach that made their work effective. The legacy of the King's visit in Highland dress extended far beyond a single day of royal engagement. It had demonstrated that traditional Scottish values remained relevant to contemporary challenges, that effective social intervention required comprehensive approaches, and that leadership meant engaging directly with the most difficult problems facing the community. Most importantly, it had shown that homelessness was not an intractable problem, but a complex challenge that could be addressed through combining adequate resources, evidence-based practice, and the fundamental Scottish principle that no member of the community should be left to face their struggles alone. The Highland tradition of clan responsibility had found new expression in the comprehensive care provided by the Shelter Trust and similar organizations across Scotland.